Yeah, so we have this very simple form, this very simple component. And what we want to do is when I type in here a username and I send the form, I want to display hello username. Malik. Mm-hmm. Yep, that is the exact steps. So I actually want to list them here. So listen for submit. What was the second step? Grab the and then but now you actually the first step you mentioned was setting the state, saving the input value to the state basically. Well, I guess this will happen on this same one.
You want to save it to the state?
Yes. Save to state, and then show message basically. Right. So we can follow this same steps. But let me see. Yeah, I think this is the example that we have in the lecture notes is slightly different, but they will still show all the main points. Let me go to that one just as I have it as a reference. Oops. Yeah. So we want to do these steps. Listen for the submit event, grab the input value, save it to the state. Now, how can we do this first step? Listen for the submit event. Hugo? We can put an on click in the button. That is correct, but we will be listening for the click event, not for the submit event, which will cause that then clicking the button is necessary to submit the form. And I want to be able to also keep submitting the form if I hit enter on the text box.
So like, can you put end of the form tag on submit?
That's correct. Yes, that's the way in which we want to do it. And here, we can listen for the unsubmit or the submit event. So unsubmit, we want to do what? Call a function, right? So I haven't written this function yet, but I'm going to do it like right after. I'm going to call it handle form submit. Handle form submit. And then I'm going to define the function right above the render. Defining a function that is going to be a method in the component doesn't matter if you do it like before the render or after the render. I have, and I don't know if this is like an industry standard, but I do prefer my render function to be the last one. And I define my other functions above the render function. So in here, I'm going to define the function handle form submit like this. And for now, let's just to see if this is all hooked up correctly, let's do console log form submitted. And let's see if we see this console log happening. So I'm gonna send the form, or thumbs up if you say we're gonna see some form submitted. And thumbs down if you say we're not gonna see the form submitted. Cool. Okay. There is some differences. Let's see what we have. I think we're gonna see actually a mix of both. Let's see what I mean by that. So let's refresh the page just to make sure that we have the latest. Then I'm gonna hit send. And we see a bit of both options. We see it and then it disappears, right? Really fast here appearing. Why is it that? Peter? To prevent the default. I want to prevent the default to avoid this, refreshing the page, right? Remember that's the default behavior in a form. So how do we prevent the default? Joanne? In the arguments here. Yeah. Event that prevent default. I have to invoke that function. Let's see, refresh, hit send, nice, thank you. So this you might remember from when we did it in plain vanilla JavaScript. Now we had to prevent the default behavior on the form to prevent the page from reloading. This is exactly the same. And also remember that all the event listeners receive the event as the argument. And we're going to be using this event heavily once for this second step, which is grabbing the input value. Cool, so we get the page to stop refreshing, which is great. Now our app is not going to refresh, or at least the entire page is not going to refresh. But then, how do we grab the input value? You might be tempted to say query selector input, but we don't want to do that. Michael.
I'm going to say
okay. So what Michael is suggesting, like, he remembers that the event has a target property, which is where the event happened. And then the target of the event is the form element, right? And then through the parent, through the form, we could get to the children and basically dig down to find the input box. But in React, we'll do it a little bit different in that case. So first, let's sort of like hold on this tab. Let's think about saving. Basically saving whatever the user types on state. So let's check down here. Text input. So we're gonna be seeing text inputs before, but that's fine. So we basically want to keep track of whatever the user types in that box. Now, where do we want to put whatever the user types in that box? What part of our app? In the state. And why do we want to put it on state? What did we say like yesterday? What did we say that are the things that we put in state? They all share something in common, and they were going to change, right? So let's add a state to this component by having a constructor first, then a super, and then a state. This dot state. equal. Let's start with an empty object. And in here, let's say I want to define a property with that is going to keep the value of that input box. So that property, I'm going to call it username. Let's call it username value. And it's going to be equal to an empty string at the beginning. Yeah. That's correct. Yes, that's a good observation. The state most commonly is an object where we have multiple properties when we have multiple inputs. It doesn't need to be. It could just be like a number or a string directly, but then that will only be for like one input, right? But generally, most likely, it's going to be an object. So it turns out that when you type, like if we think about it, when you type on this box, we know that this text is saved somewhere, right? We know how to grab it with DOM manipulation. We could just say, like, in here, document that query selector input, because there's only one. That value, right? But we don't want to do DOM manipulation. But what I want to illustrate is that this text is somewhere saved in your computer memory, right? And so it turns out that we could think of these input boxes. They keep their own state. Somewhere in them, they have the value that you specified in, right? Now, what we want to do is have sort of like access to that internal state of the input box. And we want this, like the internal state of this input box to be in sync with our React state. So the first thing that I want to do is, let's say, this is a point a little bit difficult to explain, but let's try our best. So let's say I'm gonna have this pre-populated with someone. Let's say, right? So I have this pre-populated with someone. Now I want to give this value. I want to give this value to my input box so that my input box starts with that value. So I want this input box to start with the value someone. How could I get this from here into the input box? Joy?
On the input, value equals bracket this state that username value.
That's correct. So do you remember that the same way in which we can read the value, sort of like this, by just accessing the value property, we could also set it. Right? We can say value hello, and then it changed there, right? Just the same way that we can get the value, we can also set it for input boxes. So what Joy suggested is, I'm gonna break this down into multiple lines to make it look a little bit nicer, is we set here explicitly the value property. And I'm gonna bring, since we're gonna be adding some more input boxes and form elements, I'm gonna do object destructuring on the state here. Let's say username value equal this dot state. And then I'm gonna plug in my username value that comes from my React state into my text box. And we have this. So now my input box is pre-populated with the value someone that is coming from our state. So basically, I also have like a graph for this. Let me erase this part. This is like so we have our app state, right? It has a username, val, abbreviated here to be equal to someone. Right? So this represents our app state. And then we have in our HTML, in our JSX, we have our input box, represented here by this box. So what we have is we are manually setting, we want the content of this box to be that string that we have in our state. So we basically have a connection, something like this, where from our state we're passing that property, the value property that we have in our state, to put our value in our input box. Right? And this is how we have someone show up here. Right? Because we gave, from our app state, we gave that value to our input box so far. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to have this input value give the value back to our state. Whenever I change here hello to hello or to Alejo, I want that value to go back to my state. Right? So, but any questions to this point of how we are pre-populating this input box? Yes, Mike.
Let's say you had several different forms. How would you keep track of them?
I'll probably have separate components for the different forms. So this is something that, like, for instance, I did on my Capstone project. We have like one component that is called literally login form, another component that is literally called sign up form, and they keep their own state. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yeah.
Error that says like,
Yep.
yeah.
This error says, it's not an error, it's a warning. It says fail prop type, you provided a value prop to a form field without an unchanged handler. This is warning us about like this connection not being made, which we're gonna do next. This is saying, like, this is a read-only field basically. I changed, you see, actually it doesn't even let me change it. I'm trying to erase. Trying to erase, but it doesn't do it because this value is coming from React, right? This value somewhat is coming from our app state, and we gave that value to our input box, right, through the value property. Now, what we want to do is also read from this value. Now, what we're going to do to read from this value, or to read from this input box, what we need to do is add an event listener to that input box. That event listener is going to be on change. And I want to call a function called this, that. handle, let's call it handle username change. And then on top here, I'm going to define a function. Handle username change. Receive here the event. We don't have this connection yet, but this connection will be made once we have the on change. So in here, let's do for now, let's do console.log username changed. And see what this causes. I'm gonna save, page will reload. The warning is no longer there. And then I can edit this box. Oh, actually, I can't edit it yet, but I get that user change is being called. So user change is being called. Let me see if I can share this. So that you can connect to my VS Code and see maybe the other code that you're not able to see here. So in here, what I want to do is, because I'm able to listen for when the text box, the content of the text box is going to change, I want to do the following. Or let's see. Let me do this. I'm going to comment out, I'm going to remove the value so that it's not like frozen. See if this works. Yeah. So I comment out the value. I comment out that value, but we're going to see why we want it. And then I'm going to type here. You see that every time I type something, the event listener for onChange is being fired. And this is how then we are going to grab the user, grab the input value. We basically grab the input value by having an onChange event listener that is firing every time the input box changes. And we're going to save that to the state. So I also note here what happens when I do like console log username change, and I'm going to console log the event event.target.user event.target.value. So that I console log every time. So I'm going to type A. We see A coming up. and S, D, F, G, H. So we're gonna be listening, and this is something that we didn't do when we were doing regular HTML and JavaScript. We didn't, for the most part, we didn't listen for every single change that happened on an input box. But with React, we're gonna need to do this. Otherwise, we'll require some like dumb manipulation that we don't want to do with React. We want React to do that for us. So here we have you can see that how I start typing here. Every time I type one single character, the change event is being fired on that input box. Firing this function, the handle username change, which then causes this console log. So every time I enter something here, I'm listening for the change event in the input box. When I enter a letter, that input box changed. When I do anything in that input box, the state of that input box is changing, right? Now this is the event that we're going to take advantage of to grab the input value, because we're going to keep this input in the state. So what we're going to do is the following. In our handle username change, what we're going to be doing here is setting the state, saying this.set state equal, not equal, call username value is going to be equal to the event that target that value. Let's leave the console log there. Now, what this is going to do is that in every letter that I type, the state of my component is being updated. And I'm keeping track of whatever was typed in the state. So basically, I have sort of like this connection. Where basically I'm reading, whenever I'm listening for changes here, on any change that happens in this input box, my function handle username change is being called. That function is setting the state. And if we inspect our state right now, where is not here? Let's go to components, app, state. I'm going to reduce the zoom here a little bit. State, we see this. We see my state updating. And if I go a little bit slower, I don't know, the developer tools are a little bit slow. I see that the state of that component is being updated with whatever we type in the input box. Right? Now, this puts basically the content of the input box in my state, from which then I can grab. Basically, another way to look at it is let's say, let's console log. I'm gonna remove this console log from here, from the handle username change. I'm gonna put it in the render. Let's say console log that state. Let's console log the state here to see it changing. So we see that we start with someone, then I type something, and then now my state changed to A, L, E, J, O. We end up being able to listen for changes on that input box, and we save those changes to the state. Now, once I have this, then when I hit send, then I can say hello Alejo, because I have that input, that text, I have it in the state, right? The last thing that I want to say is, this is like the most, like this, the trickiest part of this is the fact that input boxes, or how we have it right now, the way that we have it right now is, we have this, you can think of, we have this line where our input box changes and our state changes, right? But it's important to remember, and this is sort of like a technical detail, that this text, whatever text I write here, will exist in two places. It exists inside of the input itself, because the input keeps it in itself, but it also exists in my app state. And with React, and I hope you read the React documentation to go more in depth. With React, it is said that we want a single source of truth, which means we want the text that is typed here to come from only one place, or to live in only one place. So what I'm saying is, this text, whatever text I type, like that Alejo, is in two places. Is in the, and that's why I'm saying like this is sort of like tough to grasp this in the beginning, where that Alejo exists in two places. It exists inside of the input box, but it also exists in my state. So what we want to do is have state be our single source of truth, and whatever value we type in here, we set it to the state, and we just bring it back out by completing this line here. And how we do that is by sort of like closing that circle by setting the value property. In fact, let me see if, I think there is a warning popping up. If we just do it like this, let's see. I know, that's just, that doesn't really apply. But, and this is also something that you're gonna find bugs in your code, and it's gonna be because of this. Because or you're gonna find stuff, this, like grasping this will, or not grasping this will, and you're gonna make them, and that's fine. You're gonna have times where stuff is like out of sync, like one or two steps. Where let's say I type Alejo, and what gets submitted is A-L-E-J, and the O never was there. So stuff like whenever you find that your code is like out of sync for like one or two steps, it's most likely because you sort of forgot to close this circle, basically. Yeah. So what we are doing now is this is another like advantage, or you see that when I was not setting the value, then my input box doesn't have a pre-populated thing, right? When I uncomment it, it will have this value that I set up here in my state. and the input box will start with that value that we have in our state. So we basically have in our state we have someone from the app state that sort of came down to the input box and is now displaying. This input box has an unchanged listener that whenever a change happens within that input box, that is going to update the state. Then the state is updated to, let's say, a level. Then that state, because that state will come down to the input box. And we are sort of in this loop, basically. So let's say now let's erase like one letter, and I immediately see my state being updated with the same but one letter less. On every keystroke that I'm putting into this input box, my state is being updated. And I'm keeping track, or the content of this input box will live in my state. And this is a very common pattern in React, where the content of the elements that you have on your form live in your state. Why? Because you want to keep track of everything that is changing in your state. Yes?
Is this like virtual DOM?
Say that again?
It's just like the virtual DOM since it's not what's on your code. It's being, like if you were to refresh the page or look back or refresh back to what the original thing said, it's not.
Yeah, that's correct. I wouldn't say like, I think I'm not understanding like what you mean by the virtual
You're
DOM.
mentioning that virtual DOM like kind of changes the front while keeping an actual default copy, so you can't always like go back to that or something like that.
So the DOM, like there are sort of two DOMs. One that is the real DOM that you can manipulate with document that query selector, and React creates another one that we call the virtual DOM, that is like internal. But now React have them. What React is going to do is when you change something in your React application, you're changing the virtual DOM, right? And then React will compare the two DOMs, and if it sees differences, then it's going to combine them and it's going to produce the changes on the actual DOM. But in this case, yeah, I wouldn't say this applies to the virtual DOM per se. Yeah. Joy.
Now every input needs to have a value and an unchanged.
Basically, all your inputs from here on will have a value property and an unchanged property. Because you want, that is, and this is like 99% of the times, if you want to keep track of whatever is typed in there in your state. So then, from here, or other questions? Yes,
Could you go over the circle just one more time?
Mm-hmm.
The reason why we need to set the value.
Yeah, so if we do it like, let's comment out the value here. So our input box star is empty, and then I'm gonna type something here. The thing is, like, this is gonna come later in the form. I don't remember exactly like a demonstration of the bug, but basically what this is saying is that we have this text that we have something. It exists in two places. We're keeping track of it in our state, but the input box keeps its own state. So internally, it also has the word someone or something. So the word something is in two places. It's in the state and it's internally in the state of the input box. Mm-hmm. But we want we wanted to keep it in sync. So we wanted to keep it in sync. Let's say, yeah, I guess this is an example. Let's say we want to have a button that resets this input box, right? Reset, let's call it reset form. How could I erase this? Let's say I have a button. Reset. But then I'm going to type something. I think this might end up, yeah. Well, this is trying to submit the form. But how could I reset? Let's say I want this to go back to blank. Yeah.
You can set the state to set the state of this not set state.
Yeah.
This not set state. And then it's username value colon empty string.
Is that set state? Wait. Username value empty string. That's correct. So I think this is a great demonstration for that. What I'm saying, that this text exists in two places. So let's start putting something, right? So this string something exists in two places. It exists on my state because I am keeping track of all these changes that are happening in that input box, and I'm saving them to the state. But it's also kept internally. So look what happens when I click on reset. Wait, I never attached this reset form to the button. So let's do on click equal this dot reset form. Yep.
So why'd you do the event target value for the set form?
A little bit louder.
In the reset form function,
Uh-huh.
you did this not state username value equal event target value. Why is it event target value?
Oh, wait, that's not the reset form, that's this one. Correct. So in the handle username, you remember from when we did event listeners in DOM, to all event listeners, the event gets passed, right? With the event, we have access to the target, which basically means what is the element in which the event happened. Now, the element in which the event happened have all the properties like inner text, inner HTML, value is one of them. In this case, where this event happened was the input box, and we're interested in the value. That's why we say event that target that value. So let's look at this again. Refresh. So at this point we have someone, the string someone, in my state, right? We can see it here on the first render. We're not showing it here. Now I'm gonna type something here, and my state is set to something, right? Now on my state, I no longer have someone, I have something. I have the string something in my state. Now I want to reset the form. I want to erase this content, right? And Douglas' idea was to reset, just set the state back to empty string. And now I'm doing that. When I hit reset, you see that the state goes back to empty string. But this text didn't go away. That is because we're not, this this input box is not reading from the state. So that is, like, let's do it maybe in here. So we don't have this. Let's say we type in here. If we type in A in our input box, then the state gets set to A, right? Then we type in B, the change event happens again. We set our state to AB. Then we set this to C. Our state gets updated to C, right? And this is literally two different places, right? I wrote the letters ABC here and here. Now I am resetting the state when I click that other button. I'm resetting the state back to an empty string, the username value, right? That ends up doing this. It puts the state back to the empty string, but this, because this is literally two separate places, two separate strings. Because my input box is not reading from my state, now I got out of sync, right? Because in my state I have an empty string, but I'm still displaying ABC to the user. And this is something that, with more practice, will become more intuitive of getting out of sync. Yes? We don't want to do that. What we want is, when I set the state to empty string, we want this to go back to empty string. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this other line that I have in here, which is giving back the state to the input box by setting it through the value property. Yes, Cameron?
What does the bottom ABC represent?
This ABC represents literally the string ABC.
Not the form.
This input box,
Represents that.
it just represents this the input box, yes.
So you're saying it doesn't go back to nothing when you
This doesn't go back to nothing when I set the state to nothing.
need to find nothing? Because does that
I mean the empty string. So what I want to do is, so we saw that I'm typing in letters here. Let's say I'm typing my name. So let's do this again. So this represents my input box. I have two buttons, send and reset.
Yeah.
Right? And we don't have this. Now I'm typing in my name here, so I type in the letter A. This causes the state to change, right? So then in my state now I have the letter A. Now I'm gonna type in the letter L. This causes the unchanged event to happen, which is gonna update the state. Now on my state I have a L. Right? Now I put in E. On every keystroke, the state is being updated. And at the end, I end up with my name in the state. But my name, this string Alejo, it exists in two places. It is in my component state, but it is also internally in this input box. And they are connected in one way, but not in the other.
So the value of the input box.
The value of the input box. So what happens is, so the idea that Douglas came with is to just reset the state back to empty, and then the box should go back to empty, right?
Yeah.
But it turns out that when we click the reset button, we're setting the state to empty. So we do this, right? But the text box, because it had the string internally, still remains with that value.
Can you do it here on my computer?
You can plug in and we can do it.
Just don't get it.
What's up, Mike?
The reset,
the value.
How do we do that? Without query selector or
Then target.
but
So,
the event target happened in the text bar.
so when I hit,
When you click reset,
Uh-huh.
like we do then target.
Sibling.
Yeah.
No, we don't want to do too much DOM manipulation.
when I hit reset, it goes, it does exactly what you said it wasn't going to do.
But that's because you probably missed that I commented out this other, what represents this other arrow, which is
So we already
product.
solved the issue, just you're trying to point it out.
Yes, that's
Oh,
correct.
okay. All right.
I think I have another question around here.
Taking it out, it still has the value.
But, so this is going back, we set the state back to the empty string, but because we had the string Alejo in two places, it still remains in the input box. So what we need to do is sort of conceptually close this circle, so that we not only set the state out of our input box, but we also set the value of the input box from our state. And then that ends up doing it the correct behavior. And just we see it like one more time. Let's look at here the components. Let's refresh this. Then I'm gonna type something here. Here, let's do it one more time. We see that we start with this state of username someone. But when I type something, that gets reset to whatever I typed on every keystroke because I'm listening for the change event on the input box. Now I'm gonna hit the reset button, and the reset button will set my username value in the state back to the empty string. You see it going back to the empty string. But it didn't go back to the empty string in the input box. Because this input box is not reading its value from my state, it's reading its value from within itself. Which ends up we're having this information in two different places. Then here, what we do is we just set the value explicitly, like this. And setting this value explicitly is what conceptually we can think of closing this loop here. And now we have everything in sync. We have that when I refresh the page. So the key things like the unchanged represents this arrow going from, like, you can think of the unchanged as transferring the data from the input box and put it in my state, and the value giving that feedback to the input box, giving the whatever way in whatever way the state changes, the input box will change. So if we refresh now, save. Now we know that the input box starts with whatever my username value starts with, which is the string someone. And then as I change this, that changes. If I go, we see it changing. Now, if I do reset, it goes back to empty. But now it's because I change, the reset button is changing the state, and because the element is reading the content, its value from the state, we are able to get the input box back to an empty string, or basically erase it. So, if you remember something today, is your input boxes 99% of the time are going to need to be are going to need to have the value property set and listen for the change event. So you're going to need to set the value and listen for a change event. Because you don't want to go out of sync, as I just demonstrated there, where we end up with something in state, but displaying something different to the user. It's like another consequence of this could be, let's say we have a tray popping up in the screen. Let's say the user clicks X to close that tray, and my state changed, and now the state of like the tray is like closed, but it's still showing up in the screen. Right? That is an instance of same case in here where we sort of like our state got out of sync with whatever we were displaying to our user. So, questions, comments? We're going to be seeing this very often. I'm going to keep stressing it. Yes?
I don't know if it's related, but in the previous lab with the initial state and the state,
Uh-huh.
how is this different from that? Like
But-
why wouldn't we have the initial state and then set it to the initial state, which is empty?
Yeah, so I see what you're saying, like the connection. Because, yeah, this is... I could have here the same initial state. I could have the initial state that is this is that initial state. Let's say my initial state, I want my initial state to be something like your name. And then I want my state to be this, the initial state. Is exactly the same. And then here, when I want to sort of reset my form, I just say, I want my initial state. So your name, I type in my name, I reset, and it goes back to empty. So it is exactly the same, sort of the same use case. I didn't do it here like initially like this because we only had like one thing in state, right? So we could just like reset it there easily. But they sort of like having this initial state approach is good when you have more than one thing that you all want to get back to some default state. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Other questions or comments on the input box? So, yeah, be in the lookout for whenever you find that like your state changes, but whatever you're seeing didn't change. That's because you have one of these lines disconnected. Basically, you are not listening for the change, or you're not setting the value, and it's going to happen. And that's how we develop a sense for these things. So now let's add, now you add a second text box for the password. Add a second text box for the password, and we want to keep track of that password in the state as well. just comment out the setting the value. That's what I'm going to say this.
You want to see
Yeah, add the second input box for the password and save the password to state. Yep.
Save the password. Save. Just gonna show.
Yeah, it doesn't forget every console. Cool. Questions about the password input box? Yep.
For me, in my one state, the password value is above the username value. Is it this speed?
There's no speed, or it doesn't really matter if it appears before or after.
Right.
If we think about like hash tables and like objects, which what hash tables are in JavaScript, they are unordered data structures, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, they order. Other questions? I was just looking at Giselle. So let's look at password. So if we set up the password, we will want to keep an input box that's exactly the same. Instead of text, we went password. What are the other changes that we need to do? The value, right? We don't want, let's look at what happens if we do this. Why does the password seem to have something typed? Because I'm giving the password input box the value username. So this input box here has the same stuff that this one has, which we don't want. So let's create a password property in here, in our state, so that, well, in our initial state, we start with an empty string. Then we want to have a function handle password change, which is basically going to be the exact same one with one difference, which is the property that we're going to be setting, which is password in this case. Event.target that password. And then in our input box, we have the unchanged, instead of being the username, handle password change. Oh, I did camel case W. Let's correct that. Password. And we also want the value to be the value that we have in our state. Where? Oh, thank you. Value. And then here, once I bring in that, I destructure that property here, then in here I'm going to say password. Now, we probably don't want, maybe we don't want any placeholder. Maybe we want like stars. So in here we type in the username. Oh, you can see that once, this is the browser, like once we have a username and a password, like input boxes, the browser knows that and it offers me like these options. So this is all the browser's magic. And then here I'm gonna type my password, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that this information is kept in my state. So if I inspect the state of my app here, we have my username and my password. As I change my password, I have it updating there. Now from here, once this is in the state, this is where we're then gonna like send it to our server once we want to log in later on. Oh, the cool thing is that now the reset button will work it's gonna reset both input boxes, because the change that we did with Civita, which was now we're setting a few things, and we define those two things in our initial state. And in our reset form is setting the state to that initial state, where we have this default file, so we reset, password is gone, the username gets back. Right? So questions about the password input box? So in short, you want to listen for changes on input boxes, and you want to make sure that you explicitly set the value of those input boxes from your state back into your elements, back into your input boxes with the value property. You're going to listen for on change, and you're going to set the value with the value property. And I have said that like 10 times, and it's okay if you forget it after. And then come saying, why isn't my state updating? Because it's going to happen, but that's fine. That's how we learn. So, cool. So those are the input boxes. Let's look at some others. So let's say this is, we wanted to, we did this because we wanted to say hello, whatever username. So once we have it here, grabbing the input value is basically just grabbing it from the state. We're saving it to the state. Now we can just show the message. So what we can do here is that on our select or handle submit, let's see, on our handle submit, let's set the state to be submitted true. When we don't submit it, let's say the state to be submitted false, right? Submitted false, right? Now, when we submit the form, we're going to set the state to submitted true. We're going to hide the form, and we're going to show the welcome username. Similar to what some of you did on the clicker game. It's going to be exactly the same. So we have a submitted property now on our state. And we're going to have, on our handle submit, we're just going to set the state. This.set state. And we're going to set the state to be submitted true. We're going to set the state to be submitted true when we hit the submit button. Now in the render, we're going to check if the form is submitted, then we want to show the welcome message. If the form is not submitted, we want to keep displaying the form. So in our render, what we could do is if let's bring in the submitted here in the object destructuring submitted. If submitted is equal to true, which we could just abbreviate to if submitted, then let's return a div that says with an h1 header that says welcome username value. Our state now has 3 properties. We're keeping track of, and this is why it's called a state. We're keeping track of our literal state of the application. Whether how many characters are in the username, has the user filled out the form, have they submitted the form. We're keeping track of the state. Now let's see if this works. So let's try. Also I want to get, instead of your name, I prefer the form to not be pre-populated and have the placeholder. So I'm going to start the username and the password as empty strings. Username as the password and the password as empty strings. And if I have that, then Chrome will autofill my data. I guess I'm gonna hit to. Yeah, but then I'll have to remove the space. Let me just clear my stuff here. I'm not sure if this didn't do it. Now let's just open this on a incognito window. And Chrome doesn't remember that I have a username and a password for localhost 3000. So we have this. Now see what I do, Alejo. 1, 2, 3, 4. Send. Now it displays that message. Let's do it one more time. So what happens here is I fill out the form. In fact, I don't even have to type the password, but I fill out the form and then I hit send. What is send going to do? So can you walk me through what's going on once I hit send? Giselle?
And that would trigger the rendering to give out div with an H1 tag saying hello over.
That's correct. The people in the back hear that? So I'll repeat what Giselle said, which is when you click this submit button, the handle submit function gets called because we have an unsubmit event listener in it. Then what that function is doing is setting the state. Now setting the state, so here, going back to this graph. The user fills out the form, so this is all user interaction. He's setting the state is updating, render is being called. Now, there's one specific interaction, which is when the user hits submit, the function to handle the form submit gets called. That function is setting the state, so we set the state is updated. Once the state is updated, the function render gets called again. The render function has an if statement that is saying if the form is submitted true, then I don't want to show the form. I want to show the H1 tag that says welcome. And then the render ends up returning the welcome message, basically. And we get to this. Yep.
Can I see your reset button real quick, just because
Oh yeah,
I may have said something, because when I hit reset, it still fires as a submit.
Reset still firing as submit?
At least for me.
Oh yeah, that's correct.
Oh,
So we have like a small bug, which is reset is firing the submit. Oops. Reset is firing a submit, and we end up just with welcome and empty string. That is.
then, I was gonna say, put that on the reset.
Yeah. So it turns out that here we have two buttons. We have two buttons that are firing the same event, basically. And what we can do here is on the reset form, we will need to prevent the default as well. Prevent default. Wait, with this. Not sure if this is gonna fix it. Okay, yeah, that does fix it. Because we're preventing the default behavior on the button, which is to submit the form, basically. I think the reset will only, it resets both as expected.
Is
Yeah.
there a way designate the second button as not part of the submit function? Like type button?
What do you mean, like to avoid having to prevent the default?
Yes. Or do all buttons uniformly, the way they function is to reset the...
To submit the form, yeah.
Rather submit the form, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I do wonder if, like, I'll leave you this to experiment, but try to put, like, instead of the button, try to put, like, an input type submit for the submit button, and then the regular button, and see if we can get rid of the prevent default on the reset form. Yeah. So that is pretty much for today. We didn't get to cover the other input elements, but I think we did. We get to cover, like, I think the main input element, which is the input box, and then the others are basically going to be the same thing. Just like instead of the value, for instance, for a checkbox, we have checked, and so on. So that's it for today. When we get tomorrow, we are gonna cover the rest, hopefully like in an hour, and then you can get working on the lab. Yeah. Cool. So see you all tomorrow.
This also be able to work, so I don't have it necessarily reset, but I have here. It takes me to my welcome page.
That's cool.
I have it as, because I was thinking at first, like with this, with like showing a message, but also having it reset. I have a user value, a saved value, password, saved password, and then I have it submitted. And whenever it's submitted, whatever was in the value at first goes to save, and it refreshes.
Yeah, that's fine. I feel like
because I didn't know, like, in terms of like if we were like how we were doing to-dos and we were posting, if we were to get rid of it without the reset and just like you hit enter and it sends it there, would it be better to grab it from like a save as opposed to straight from there? Because it also would have to refresh and the state would have to go back to being clear.
Yeah, so the thing is, like, in that example, what we're gonna do is, like, we probably have like an array of to-dos, and what we do is, like, we save the to-do there, and that's where the to-do lives, and then we reset the input boxes in this case. So yeah, you basically have a rudimentary version of that, which is sort of like still holding on to the information for later use.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Anger or just because?
I try to do something like I have like some authentication thing. Like I had just like another thing and just correct just to see if it worked. And basically it was like if it's equal to that, true. If it's false, and if it's false, then I'm here. And like if it's false, then there's probably a way to make this make more sense, but it's like the only difference is that this will say this at the bottom.
Okay.
I think I'm added like one thing too many.
Yes. So you have some syntax problems, but I really like this idea. I think your syntax problem is that. Oh wait, what is the error? Show me the error that is popping up.
It says JSON JSX wrapped in the quotes.
Yeah. So then the thing is that you're returning your render is returning two elements, like which is this div and then this other div. And if you remember from the first lesson in React, the render needs to return one thing. So what you can do is just wrap this on another div, and that ends up returning one thing. Or maybe, actually, what you want to do is just put this div inside of this div.
Okay.
Yeah, like put this div with the h1 inside of. Or in fact, you could just put in the h4. You know what I mean? Which is basically remove these two things.
Okay.
That ends up putting the h4, and then remove this one too. That one. So what you effectively did is just one div, the form and the h4. You will need to make sure that this one is the same. Oh, okay, no, this one is fine. Yeah, that one's fine.
Where's it different? Oh, because I wanted to add like the usernames. Okay.
So let's try now. Oh, maybe we have some curly brackets issues.
Oh yeah. I really deleted. I was doing a bunch of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Do not mutate state directly.
Say that again.
It says do not mutate state directly. I think it's like a read. Set state.
Let's look at user info form line 36. Wait, actually, not line 36, line 39. Oh yeah.
Set state.
Set state, yeah. Yep. Remember that instead of equal, you need to put a colon.
Good night, Yusuf.
Right. Yep.
Is there any chance I could use the conference room one, the tall one, the long one?
I think if it's available, I'm not sure if it's available right now, but if it is, yeah. We can go check it out.